Hi everyone, I'm Matt Courtney and I'm really excited to be here today. I am the English Hub lead at the Wandle English Hub, which is based in Cheston Primary School in Battersea. And I'm really excited to be talking today with Nazneen Ahmed Pathak about her brilliant work. Nazneen is a British Bangladeshi writer, historian and visual artist who lives in Southampton. She has a PhD in Bangladeshi literature from the University of Oxford. As a historian, she researches the geography and history of migration, a subject which is also close to her heart, and much of her fiction, poetry, and visual arts practice, which we're talking about today. So, welcome, Nazneen. Really excited to talk to you today.
Hi, Matthew. It's really wonderful to be here.
Really excited to be talking to Nazneen about the publication of her recent amazing book, The City of Stolen Magic. If you haven't read it yet, really recommend getting your hands on a copy. Try not to give away too many spoilers today as we delve in. And as Nazneen's waving, I've got my well-thumbed copy here next to me too. We try not to give too many spoilers away today as we discuss it. So Nazneen, the first question I had for you, as we've just seen, is the book has a beautiful front cover, but also inside there's lots of lovely illustrations throughout. I was wondering what made you opt for a multimodal novel?
Um, yeah, it's absolutely. I have to say so myself. It's an absolutely gorgeous cover, illustrated by Sandhya Prabhat, who is an Indian origin illustrator who is based in the US, and she's really done the story justice in terms of the cover, but also we have some gorgeous maps that have been made by another illustrator who's called Leah. And yeah, there are chapter head illustrations all the way through, and then big kind of full page illustrations in each part. And I think there are multiple reasons why we have so much illustration in this work. Partly because this is, we're still coming out of lockdown. So there is, and I'm sure some of the teachers who are listening may be aware that, there is still some kind of impact being felt in schools in terms of literacy and literacy targets in terms of the children who had spent a lot of time on their own in lockdown. So it is useful to have a lot of illustrations in a book that is quite fairly challenging. It's fairly chunky for a middle grade. But also the fact that I felt like this book is not just for Indian heritage children, it's for all readers. And so there are bits of this story that are not going to be unnecessarily easily visualizable, if that's a word, for children from different backgrounds. So the bits that are set in Bangladesh may not be kind of things that can be easily visualized by readers who've never been there, but also the bits in London. This book has just been published in India as well, so it's they may not be easily imagined by readers there. So the illustrations give everyone some way into the story.
Thanks, Nazneen. I absolutely love books with maps. I just think about maps in
I
a
got
book.
two. I keep being really proud when everyone says, "Ooh, maps! We love maps in a bit." But I actually have a surprise one that comes right at the beginning of chapter part 4, which is not a spoiler, so that everyone knows that it is coming up. So there's one of Dhaka and there's one of London. So there are
Absolutely
two
love it.
maps.
At the end of the novel, you include Lisa's guide to understanding the Ingresi language. What
Yeah.
is your novel communicating about the impact of empire on language?
So one of the novels I was really influenced by when I was writing this book is an adult novel. Well, it's a series of novels by the amazing writer Amitav Ghosh. So he wrote these books called the sorry, my daughter's here because she's not had a very good nap, so she's very grumpy. But now she's interested in my headphones. So the Amitav Ghosh wrote these books, which were set in kind of the 19th century, and they are amazing in terms of looking at kind of representing a hybrid Hindi, Urdu, English kind of language that's spoken by sailors on the ships across the world between the kind of 18th and 19th century. That all these key kind of communities that were kind of mingling together on the ships they were actually kind of cosmopolitanism in real life, and they were exchanging language as well as culture and community all the time. And so it's not just that, English is now one of the national languages of India as a result of colonialism, but actually the fact that English itself has been marked and changed by the interaction and the encounter with India. So we have so many Indian words in English that we use without even realizing they're from South Asian languages. So veranda, bungalow, I could keep going on. There's so many, and it just demonstrates how empire colonialism is a kind of a meeting of cultures that then get mixed together, and that no one comes out of that kind of encounter unchanged, and that has resulted in the society and the languages that we're speaking today.
Thanks, Leslie. I think that's a theme that's really kind of prominent throughout the novel. So it's great to hear you talk about that. There's a moment in the book, again, trying not to give too many spoilers away, but just before the 19th chapter, there's a moment, kind of vignette, where the boy and the doll is mentioned. And London, what is one of the sections of the novel, is the only part of the novel which begins in this way. Could you elaborate for us? Why did you decide to start this section off in this way?
I had lots of discussions with my editors about this particular section. It was really funny that it was picked up on as a story, as a question, because um, yeah, it is a bit of an odd little fragment, and I think it is actually a bit of a darling in that way because it doesn't really fit, but it was a section that I wrote that really visualized a particular type of magic that isn't necessarily, I don't have space to really explore it elsewhere in that story, though suggestions might be coming up in another answer I give, but about future stories. But also that I just felt like it was a way of kind of visualizing how scary people taking children is, and that kids are just going around, they're just in their everyday world, and then suddenly they're a target because of their magic. So I think that's one of the reasons why I kept it still in there, why it's kind of a little piece on its own. But I also I do like the way it's written, and it's got a slightly different tone, and it's just a bit, yeah. I just really like that piece of writing, so it stayed in. And my editors agreed, so they were just not ruthless enough. So yeah, but it is a bit different.
I'm really glad you kept it in, and I'm also very
Oh,
excited about the possibility of finding a bit more about that type of magic and that little world as well. So yeah, very
yeah.
exciting. Throughout the novel, you combine fictional and historical details. Could you share for us three interesting historical facts that you discovered when you were kind of doing the research and thinking about creating your characters and the world of the book?
Okay. So one of the facts that I could share with you is the fact that it is really significant that it is 1855. So in 1854, we have some of the biggest uprisings against indigo cultivation in Bengal. So there's actually a play that is written by a Bengali playwright who has been, the indigo kind of ravaged Bengal. So the forced cultivation of indigo resulted in famines that just continued throughout the 19th and 20th century. And in 1854, farmers started to collect together and actually rise up against the East India Company and refuse to grow it anymore. And the playwright who wrote the play Indigo Mirrors actually ended up staging this drama about one family who are impacted by the famine, and the play itself ended up being performed in the fields by farmers. So that is part of the backdrop of what I'm writing about, and actually my story opens with someone coming to Champa's mother because her husband fields are not growing food properly, and they are going to starve. So that as a result of growing indigo. So that's one fact. The other fact that kind of bookends the story is that we're leading up to a moment when everything changes in Bengal, which is 1857, which is the huge uprising of the Indian origin soldiers against the East India Company. They've been employed by them to maintain order across India, and they're actually they rise up against it. And as a result, the East India Company is disbanded, and the British government itself actually steps in to take over control of British India. So that's another historical fact that's there. That is something I'm looking forward towards in this story. And the final historical fact would be that the name, the one of my characters, a very beloved character of mine, is called Tipu. And Tipu is named after Tipu Sultan, who was actually an Indian king from the 18th century, but who is a kind of figure who is in the backdrop of this story. And that's why I named my character Tipu, is that there has always been resistance to the British Empire. And Tipu Sultan's objects are actually to be found in the Victoria and Albert Museum because they were taken from his palaces when he was killed by the British in battle in the 18th century. So those are three historical facts that kind of have informed the way I've written this story.
Thank you so much for sharing those. And I think that's something that's done so well in the novel, that combination of kind of the magic and the kind of fantasy elements with the historical elements. I found myself Googling a lot of things alongside it and kind of looking at the history alongside it, which was super interesting.
That's exactly what I hope kids will do.
Mm.
I think of history as breadcrumbs, and a trail of breadcrumbs that you can follow yourself to find out more about the actual events that took place and your own opinions about those. So I really hope that anyone who's curious about any of the things that are in the story will then go out and do their own research, become historians themselves.
I love the idea of breadcrumbs. There's so many children that kind of sprung to mind, children I taught previously that'd be so interested in kind of delving into parts of history as a result of reading the book. So yeah, I can definitely
Yeah,
see that happening in the classroom. The,
fantastic.
one of the other things I that noticed that kind of struck me throughout the novel is the impact of fairy tales, the way that's referenced in the book, and the impact that those fairy tales can have on the young Indian characters in the novel. Thinking about reflecting on fairy tales and how useful they are and how they can be used in the classroom, what are your reflections on the usefulness of fairy tales being taught in school to children today?
Well, I'm not that familiar as to how fairy tales are taught in schools and which fairy tales are taught, but from the kind of fairy tales that we have in our, popular culture and the ones that I kind of read growing up, I just found it really fascinating because I learnt Bengali when I was a child, and one of the things I read in Bengali were fairy tales that my grandfather had printed. He was a publisher in Bangladesh, an educational publisher. So he used to post me books in Bengali, and I would read them with my parents to learn how to read Bengali. And so I'd read fairy tales like Aladdin and the 40 Thieves, and you know, and other kind of fairy tales that have similarities or ostensibly the same story, that I'd read in English books of fairy tales, but they'd have like very slightly different kind of uh, ways of being told, different kinds of perspectives, and I think that we're in this world where now we're starting to think about that actually. So for a long time, our fairy tales have only come from certain traditions, particularly from the Grimm's kind of set of storytales from Western Europe. So how do we move beyond that? How do we move beyond and use fairy tales from different cultures within the classroom and different versions of the fairy tales that we have, that we can then rework or retell from different perspectives, maybe different characters' perspectives? There's lots of opportunities there for creative writing and creative reimagining in the classroom too. If we start thinking about, actually, where did this actually story originate? Who started telling these kinds of stories? Are there parallel stories from other cultures around the world that we might want to use in conjunction and thinking about them comparatively? that has a lot of potential. And
Yeah, that sounds like a really exciting way to explore fairy tales in the classroom, and something I think often we might think of fairy tales with kind of younger children, but that idea of exploring fairy tales across the world could be definitely something, and reimagining them could be something that could be done with
yeah.
children in Key Stage 2, I can imagine too.
Yeah, and we can see from the Disney retellings recently that, that there is so much in fairy tales for us to explore in terms of gender, in terms of power, that we have loads of kind of YA books that take us to fairy tale and then and run with it and give it a full lived world. So yeah, there's lots of opportunities there.
Yeah, really exciting. People listening, please do send in your questions for Nazneen, and we can answer those towards the end as well. So please do send those in. Nazneen, another kind of symbol or feature in the book is the idea of fire, and that's something that's really prominent throughout the text. And thinking about Alia's character, and what does she represent in the novel?
So the character of Alia is a jinn. She's a genie, as you know from the kind of English version of the Persian word jinn. And so she's a spirit. She's a fire spirit. And in the Quran, in the Muslim holy book, jinn are actually do feature in the Quran. And um, it is said that jinn used to walk the world um, parallel to us, so that we could almost um, they would be in the world, but and we could almost see them, but not quite, because they're made of this kind of smokeless flame. And that to me was really interesting, and it kind of corresponded well as well with the fact that when I would go to Bangladesh see my family in the village my father grew up in, the jinn used to be in the trees. They were real beings that used to cause kind of trouble, and we were warned about them. So for Jin, so the character of Alia is really kind of referencing that kind of uh, kind of folklore that is almost real. But fire as well is this kind of really interesting kind of metaphor for power as well. So it is, at the beginning, Jumper, she creates this piece of magic. In order to prove to Ummi that she should be allowed to use the magic that she's been born with and that she's really proud of, and she can't control it, and it goes terribly wrong, and it results in this kind of flame that is going to spread through the village and cause devastation. And um and it kind of creates a whole series of events that results in Chumpa's mother being abducted, and the journey she has to go on as a result. So it's about, at that big moment, Jumper has this power in fire, but she cannot control it. It's something um that she is really proud of, but she also isn't aware of how dangerous it can be. And I guess, power wielded by certain people is a damaging, destructive thing. But when we share it, when we learn how to use it and control it, and we use it for to raise up those who need it, then it's something that is important and useful. And so to me, it's a very useful metaphor for thinking more widely about kind of how do we use power responsibly? How do we share it? How do we use it to bring justice into the world?
Thanks, Nazneen. There's kind of an obvious villain threat in the character of Clive Devane's in the novel, but another threat or kind of theme that comes out is the impact of famine, which kind of goes throughout the novel. And you've already mentioned the how you've drawn upon history and the history of empire and colonialism when creating the text. What are the connections between empire and famine, and why did you choose to make these kind of discrete allusions to famine throughout the novel?
Yeah. Thank you, Matthew. I'm really glad to be able to answer this question. So when I was doing my research on migrant communities in 19th century East London, Um, firstly, I wasn't really sure of what I was going to find, particularly about the community that now be described as Bangladeshi, which is a community I'm from. And because that area is known as Banglatown, but it I thought the migration had happened after the World War when my father arrived in the 1960s. But actually, what I found was that sailors from a Bangladeshi background, from Bengal, from across India, had been traveling to London for hundreds of years on the merchant navy ships. And as a result, a lot of them had jumped ship and made their homes in London, or they'd struggled along in London and sought help. So one of the places that recorded the number of kind of foreign or strange sailors or peoples living in London was actually a missionary called Joseph Salter, and he actually was trying to convert sailors who were Hindu or Muslim who were in London. He was trying to convert them to Christianity by giving them food or helping them out or speaking to them in their languages. But he'd also record the numbers of sailors who were coming into London, and his records and his accounts are part of the London City Mission archives. And I went there and I looked at those archives when I was doing my research on the project. And one of the things I found was that in various years there were rises in numbers of sailors who were coming in to London and jumping ship in London from South Asia. And there were these big spikes, and then other years there wouldn't be very many. And I went back and I was reading some other histories of famine in India. And when I kind of correlated the two together, it was when the famines were happening in 19th century India that we'd have these huge spikes in South Asian sailors on the ships, and South Asian sailors settling in London because they needed to find another living for their to keep their families alive. So we have this really direct connection between famine, migration, and empire. So when we're asking those questions about uh, where are you really from? Why are you here? My answer is always we're here because the British were there, because of the fact of all the different kind of things that happened as a result of colonization, as a result of empire, as a result of enslavement. So those are as soon as we start to really unpack those kinds of historical data, we can really see it in the very kind of very discrete and concrete connections between the two, there. So thank you for asking me that question, because that's something that not everyone knows.
It's so interesting to hear about your process in the research, and that's something that's so evident in the book, how well researched and how much kind of background history and knowledge is kind of explicitly in parts of the book, but also implicitly. So yeah, kind of the allusions to famine being prominent throughout the book is one example, but there's lots in there. So it's really interesting to hear about kind of the in-depth research you've done that really comes through in the book. So kind of related to that, in the classroom, some people would argue that primary school students are perhaps too young to explore historical details related to empire or concepts related to race and racism. However, in your novel, you've got young children fighting for justice. In what ways do you think we can empower students, but also teachers, to challenge prejudice and discrimination through literature?
Um, It's a wonderful question. I think, when we get that suggestion of, that argument that children are too young, well, some children don't get a say. Some children always have to live with those legacies of and traumatic and difficult histories. And so it's important for all of us to kind of learn about it and understand it. It's also the reason why our society looks the way it does. And it explains why we're all here and we're all British. So there's all those reasons that it's really important that we try and find ways to talk about this kind of history. And I hope one day that we will have kind of it become statutory, that we learn about colonialism and enslavement, and we move beyond kind of Vikings, who are really exciting, but there's so much more that we could do with our history syllabus. And I know teachers are using literature as a way to do that and supplement that in the absence of those kinds of bigger kind of governmental frameworks. And that's incredible. And so there are books like mine, which are imaginative and speculative retellings that we can use. There are also loads of incredible kind of biographical kind of stories that are coming out. Sufia Ahmed's really incredible story about Nuranisa Khan, Nuranisa Inayat Khan, the spy princess, the Muslim spy, who was so brave and who died as a result of her work in the Second World War. But we also have other really imaginative stories like the Lizzie and Bell mysteries by Joanna Brand. So we have a lot there that's coming out now that we can use and use as jumping points, really, that in a way that I was talking about breadcrumbs. So for children to find out more by themselves. And I think literature is so important in terms of the fact that it enables us to walk in another's shoes. That sense of empathy that we could develop when we're reading a story from another person's perspective and experience is something that we don't really get through any other form. It's a really, we follow one person's embodied experience through a book, and that means that it can be really transformative. It can really change the way we see the world if we start to understanding what someone feels like when they experience racism. If we've never experienced racism ourselves, we can explore that through a book. And it might make us think about how we choose our words, how we speak, how we treat others. So I think that, for me, literature is a incredibly kind of powerful tool to be using in the kind of search for social justice and the fight for social justice, and at every age. We have some amazing authors coming out now who are really giving us those resources that we can use, whether they be non-fiction, fiction, or poetry, that to speak about these themes at every level.
I completely agree, Nazneen. And I think in the discussion, the panel discussion earlier, the primary discussion, there were so many great examples of texts that do that. As you say, that range of, you've got like the fantasy world, non-fiction. Really, there's really great texts available. We need to get them in the hands of the teachers, essentially. And I know that the Lit in Colour have got those lovely book lists, especially for primary. And take a look at, and they're a kind of great springboard to start with.
Yeah, so City and Stolen Magic, Lit in Colour produced a whole set of teaching resources that go with it, and also with Satnam Sangera's book, Stolen History. So if you want to use those in the classroom, then those resources are right there to be used to help you, because I know how difficult it is to produce resources from scratch if you're a teacher. So people there doing these things to make it even easier to get those into the classroom, to have those discussions.
Brilliant. And I was imagining, I think it's such a good book to read aloud. I can really imagine reading it aloud in the classroom because there's so many exciting bits, kind of cliffhanger parts. There's lots of excitement there, and lots of, can just imagine children wanting to know what happens next.
Originally, there was another prologue that was going to be a section where it's a grandmother talking to her grandchild, and it is about like, this is how we came to England, this is our story. So it's always got that kind of very oral kind of storytelling tone to it, because it's kind of being told in that way. So yeah, I do think it works really well out loud.
One of the earlier you mentioned kind of the possibility of future stories. I was wondering, have you thought about continuing Chompa's story, or perhaps a different book altogether? What are your kind of thoughts or plans at the moment?
So I am working on book 2. It is a series, so I am working on book 2 at the moment, and yes, and again, it's bringing in. I think it's partly because I couldn't fit in all the history that I wanted to explore in this book, but also wanted to work up to 1857 and a fictional version of that. So this book will be 1856, and then there'll be one in 1857. So, and just to give you a little sneak peek, I discovered that there was actually a Hindu queen and an Muslim queen who were both involved in the uprisings of 1857, not together, but kind of neither both of them were kind of supporting it in surreptitious ways. One was a direct kind of she fought alongside soldiers against the British. So I wanted to bring those in. So the idea of rebel queens is really a big theme in the next story because I have my own rebel queen just
I love that. That's so exciting to hear that there's more to come. That is really, really exciting. And love to get a little sneak preview there about what might be featured there. Thank you so much, Nazneen. We've got some questions from the audience now. I think there's still time if people want to. We've got some here, but please do send in more if there's questions. So the first question is, Tankagrupa, the Empress, is now a GCSE play text. And there's a significant amount of intertextuality between your text and the Empress. Could you please comment on this and tell us if you used it as part of your research when writing The City of Stolen Magic?
I really did. I think this is just an amazing I didn't realize it was on the GCSE syllabus, so that is really exciting to me. I did go to see it when it was first performed, like its first set of performances at Stratford. I think it was in 2015 or 2016. While I was working on my research on East London, um, and it one of my colleagues had actually been the historical advisor on the Empress. So it's really, really close. And I had, it was directly in my mind when I was writing City of Stolen Magic. And I do think the scene when they go into the pub and they meet all the peddlers who used to be sailors, it is kind of quite theatrical in its own way. It's like a little mini kind of stage set inside the story. So I think they work really well together. Yeah, definitely.
Amazing. Someone's asked if there are any other texts that have influenced or you use as part of your research process when crafting the novel.
Mm. So the Amitav Ghosh stories, which I can't quite remember the names of now, they were a big influence. Also, I think Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children has always been something that I've always been hugely inspired by. It changed my life when I read that story. But also, I think one of the things is that when I was a child, I was really struck when I read The Secret Garden and Little Princess. And to me, the characters in those stories growing up in the 1980s were Indian girls. They were South Asian, brown skinned Indian girls. They'd come from India. They were homesick for India. They found England cold and inhospitable. And so I internalized that as being kind of that they were like me. They had that same experience. Also, in the absence of any actual directly direct stories of British Asian kids in the 1980s. So one of the things was when I reread them and I discovered that they kind of laced with quite a lot of toxic stuff about race and the superiority of kind of British Christianity, for example. It was almost like a negative pushback. Like I was like, okay, like these are the stories we have about India, but I don't want those to be the ones that my kids read. So I mean, I want them to be able to read them critically with something else by them in the same period. So that's kind of one of the inspirations, like the kind of forces pushing me forward to kind of write this story was really that there wasn't that much out there that was really talking about this period, talking about colonialism and its connections to migration and famine, and that I wanted my children to have those tools to be able to make sense of that for themselves. And that's why it's 10 years old. My son's 10, started writing it when he was actually born. And it was kind of clarifying at the moment. And it's like, I don't want you to have to imagine yourself into stories. I want you to be able to see yourself there directly.
That's amazing, and yeah, it's amazing to hear. First of all, how long the process, and you can see the effort and that's gone into the book. But yeah, completely that driving force to be able to let your children see themselves in the book that sounds really important. This is a really interesting question. Someone's asked, since your book's been published, what have young people, but also adults, said to you about the book?
Um, a lot of young people have said they couldn't put it down, which is wonderful because I think the one, I I do want to talk about colonialism. I do want to talk about power. I do want to talk about equity. But I want to do it in a fun way that's appropriate for kids. Because I also think that South Asian kids and all kids deserve stories that are fun, exciting, that all kids deserve to have the adventures out there. So to know that my story is one that kids can race through as well because it's exciting. It's really great to know that I'm not preaching to them, that they're having a good time while they're reading it is wonderful. So that's been really wonderful to hear. Yeah, like I've had a lot of feedback from readers who are teachers who are like, I can't wait to read this in class. Exactly that, I'm going to use it as the one we read out loud at the end of the class, um, and also just that there's a kind of a real love for Jumper, the main character, because she's not perfect. She is a bit spiky. She's a bit impulsive, but some of my readers have really embraced her for all those flaws and her bravery and her kind of her just will to kind of go out there and make a difference has really connected with them. So that's been wonderful.
I can really relate to the sense of wanting to like finish it really quickly and go through it. And as you say earlier, it's quite a chunky book for the kind of age range it's aimed at. But I can imagine children still finishing it really quickly just because they're desperate to read
So
the
some
next
have said
bit.
they've registered it in 24 hours, which I just
Wow,
think is insane. I was like, did you sleep? Did you
can't put it
sleep?
down. Very impressive. Just take a moment to mention, people mentioned in the chat about kind of tips for using diverse literacy in the classroom, and the panel from the teacher discussion earlier put together a top tips document, which is
Fantastic.
available, and it kind of relates to some of the themes you've mentioned, Nazneen, in kind of using the power of literature and using those texts in the classroom.
Mm.
Um, there's also a question about the book being really imaginative. Um, how do you encourage children, young people, to artistically express themselves?
Oh, I love this question. Thank you so much. Because before I started teaching literature at Exeter, and I was actually freelancing as a creative practitioner. So I would go into schools, I would try and, meld together kind of creative writing and history and art to create workshops that were engaging for young people so that they could start to write and develop their own kind of artistic expression. So yeah, I think that you know I do often encourage young people to think of the question, what if? So I think what the question, what if, was kind of where I began with this story. So what if, the East India Company actually was trading magic? It was probably the big what if behind City of Stolen Magic. And when I asked that question, suddenly, like, there was another what if question. Okay, so there was what if then they were trading magical children who had powers, and what if those magical children then rose up against the East India Company? So you can see how, like, you can get this chain reaction of kind of questions that each one of them opens up a pocket of possibility for you to kind of either write or draw or whatever you want to do with that, you've got that there. I think in sometimes we focus a lot on perfection, either if it's in terms of handwriting or in terms of grammar. And one of the things that it's wonderful to be able to do as an author or who goes into schools is to actually say, actually, for a moment, let's just hold all that back. Let's just think about this as play. Let's think about of what you want to do in this space, how what you want to say, and then we can fix all the other stuff later, and just allow yourself to flow, allow yourself to connect with that part of your brain that you might sometimes gets a bit clouded over when we're really anxious about spelling or handwriting and stuff. So just kind of, I like the kind of ideas of mindfulness and kind of ways in which we can encourage very kind of creative expression and spaces where we can just explore and play imaginatively with words and language, especially. So, yeah,
Brilliant.
definitely.
Yeah, I think there's some really clear ideas people could take and use in the classroom in English, but also other subjects there to
Yeah.
encourage them to think creatively. Brilliant. Someone's put in it, I think we didn't, we kind of glossed over this earlier, to say congratulations on having your book published in India, which is absolutely amazing. So congratulations. How does it feel to have your book published there?
It's amazing. It's absolutely amazing because I did travel to India several times for research over the period that I was writing the book, and there's actually a parallel museum in Mumbai, which is was opened in the same year as the Victorian Albert Museum and was used to be called the Victorian Albert Museum. And there they have this very kind of peculiar exhibition of dolls that are all kind of trades or craftspeople of India. And it's actually a little kind of trade exhibition. So we have that kind of like the parallel histories of museums as well. So, and just to have this in the hands of young Indian readers. So next month it's going to be featured quite prominently in a chain of bookshops there. I was just kind of profiled in one of the national newspapers in India. And it's just incredible to be able to think that, there'll be young Indian readers, young British, Asian and British readers, all reading the same book, all having similar conversations because we're all connected. So that's why it's so exciting.
Oh, that's so exciting. And I'm sure they'll be rushing to finish it as quickly as the readers here are as well. So I think you've answered this question already. Somebody has mentioned, just wanted to share this, that they're getting copies of the book for their school, and they wanted to know if you're going to continue the story. So I'm sure they're delighted to hear about that. Brilliant. So the book Wonder was embraced by lots of primary schools for its narrative on fitting in, family, love, identity, friendship, and self-acceptance. Is there a similar book for children of colour that you can think of?
I really love Shana Jackson's books. So I really love God, I can't remember the title. What's it called?
Is it I've got it off my head. Mystery London? No, sorry.
High Rise Mystery.
High Rise Mystery. That's
Mystery. Yeah, and I use that in my teaching a lot, even with university students, because I think the way she writes race gentrification is really interesting, but it's also a detective novel, and it's got this like feisty sister duo. It's just got a really amazing, strong sense of place and community. So I think it's a really wonderful resource for primary and kind of year 7, 8 as well. So I think that's one that I would recommend. I think some of the books I recommended earlier, the Spy Princess book is really great by Sophia Ahmed. If you want to think about the Second World War when that's the topic, and then you can kind of use that as a supplement that is actually like, oh, you know what? There were actually a lot of kind of South Asian and African contributions to the First and Second World War that we don't often hear about. So that's another good one to use in that respect.
I agree, and I think one of the kind of the really exciting things for me as a teacher, one of the recent developments of kind of historical fiction, which shines a light on kind of underrepresented voices, which is what your book does, and what so many more books are doing now, which is really exciting.
Yeah.
Especially when teachers think about working kind of in a cross-curricular way, and using literature to drive that. That's a really exciting development, kind of recent published in. Brilliant. Nazneen, it's been so lovely to hear about your work and your research and all of the effort and thought and that's gone into the book, and it's so exciting to talk to you. I've absolutely loved it. I'm sure so many people are excited to either read the book if they haven't, which they need to do immediately, or use it in the classroom soon. So very exciting. Thank you so much for being so generous with your time and sharing all of the wonderful work you've been doing.
Oh, thank you so much, Matthew, and thank you everybody. Thank you to Tez and to LiT in Colour for supporting this, and it's just been a wonderful conversation. I hope you've all enjoyed it as much as I have.
Amazing. Thanks so much. I'll hand over to Leslie now.
So thank you everyone for attending and engaging with the discussion that we've had here for this primary session of the first ever LiT in Colour Teacher Conference. We'll be sending out the book bundles next month, so please do make sure that you've scanned the QR code so that you can be entered into the prize draw. As mentioned, we have a number of free resources available on penguin.co.uk, also on Tez's Black Experiences Hub, so do check them out. We've got wonderful resources with Nazneen Ahmed Pathak, so please do engage with them and see what you can do in your classrooms.
There is a resource for City of Soul and Magic, The Empress, and Girl, Woman, Other. That details some key features of each text if you're considering auditing and amending your curriculums to include one of these texts. The teachers from the reflective sessions have kindly compiled some top tips, as mentioned by Matthew earlier, that they considered while engaging with the process of diversifying their curriculum content. These tips are great for personal use and can also be shared with members of your department. Following the session, we will send an evaluation form. As it's our first Lit in Colour Teacher Conference event, we'd really appreciate it if you would fill it out so that we can use your feedback to inform future events. Thanks again for your time and your engagement, and thank you to TES, our partner for this event. We hope you have a wonderful start to this new school year and are able to make some meaningful changes to your curriculum and classroom choices. Wish you all the best for this afternoon. Bye-bye.